Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for a very exciting discussion with Her Excellency Lolwa Al-Khater. We will be discussing the Gulf crisis and the GCC regional rebalance. I am sure when the news was announced on June 7th, 2017, that the Quartet were initiating a blockade against Qatar, many of us did not speculate it would last as long as it did today. Yet here we are almost 2 years later, and the crisis remains a critical roadblock to the region's harmony, political interests, and security. In fact, rather than showing signs of an impending rapprochement, signals continue to indicate that the Gulf crisis is becoming an institutionalized aspect of the GCC's regional reality. As the time span increases for the blockade and the initial shock has passed, the bargaining power to resolve the crisis continues to diminish in many regards. New infrastructures and means of business were implemented in order to ensure Qatar's sustainability. Now that these pathways have crystallized more permanent relationships, there have inevitably emerged proverbial winners and losers within the Gulf crisis. For example, in the wake of the blockade, trade between Qatar and Oman increased 240%, a new trade relationship which was solidified by the crisis. Of course, the lessons and observations of the crisis are not limited to the region, but speak to global processes related to the strategic decisions of small states, especially for those in hostile neighborhoods. Qatar's resilience evidences how small states lacking in traditional numbers and military muscle can use asymmetric power in the form of advanced technologies, economic interdependencies, diplomacy, and international institutions in order to leverage their interests. Surely these issues linger in the mind of the leadership of small states in the Gulf, including Kuwait, which experienced a 14-year Saudi-initiated blockade from 1923 to 1937. An underlying issue for the existing crisis is the United States signaling of the regional withdrawal. New players are already beginning to turn to the Gulf region, rebalancing strategic alliances. The ever-creeping institutionalization of the Gulf crisis has had substantial impacts for the U.S. interests, which views a unified GCC as a counterbalance to Iran's influence. While I don't think anyone is expecting to learn about some kind of magical solution to the Gulf crisis, our guest today is one of the most qualified individuals on the ground to discuss her perspectives on the effect of the crisis on the regional rebalance. We are honored to welcome Her Excellency Lolwa Rashid Al-Khater, spokeswoman of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar. Before her appointment as spokesperson, she joined the ministry as Foreign Affairs Minister Plenipotentiary. She also served as the Director of Planning and Quality at Qatar Tourism Authority and as a research project manager at Qatar Foundation. Additionally, she is an author and scholar focused on the Arab world and is currently a researcher at Oxford University where she is pursuing her PhD. Now, we know that the Women's History Month is coming to an end, so it's important to note Lulwa's outstanding accomplishment, along with other women across the Gulf. You can see that they have achieved many milestones in politics in the Gulf today. So I would like everyone to give all women globally a round of applause for their accomplishments. We also today, we have one of the most qualified individuals to moderate the conversation, Mr. Tim Constantine. He's an opinion writer with the Washington Times and the host of a well-known show, The Capitol Hill Show. Please join me in welcoming both guests for what I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion about the GCC's new regional balance.
Your Excellency, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Tim, for being with me today, actually. And I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to Dania, as well as the Gulf International Forum for the kind invitation.
It was nearly 2 years ago that Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, and Egypt implemented the embargo or blockade. Let's do just economics 101. The impact of this blockade on ground transportation, on air transportation. Let's talk strictly economy for the moment. What are the initial impacts 2 years ago?
Absolutely. So when this blockade started, June 5th, 2017, suddenly we woke up in the morning. The land borders were closed. The sky, the sea. We were unable to mobilize anything into Qatar, outside Qatar. So it was a 360-degree blockade in the first at least 48 hours or so. It wasn't until we were given a passage through Iran, with which a country with which we didn't have any diplomatic ties at the time. It was through that passage that we were given, we were able to ship, you'll be surprised, thousands of cows on airplanes, and also our need in terms of food supplies, medicine, etc. In addition to this and that, let's remember that Qatar is a country that's preparing for the World Cup. So all the material we used to get for the World Cup in terms of construction, etc., used to come through either Saudi, the land borders, the only land borders we have, or United Arab Emirates. So we had to, what we describe today as diversifying our supply chains. And today, as we're talking, Qatar imports its goods from everywhere. From Asia, from Europe, from Australia, from Africa, with the exception of the 3 GCC blockading countries, namely Saudi, UAE, and Bahrain.
You mentioned importing cows.
Yes.
And let's talk just for a minute about how much of the food of Qatar was imported prior to the blockade.
You mean through the blockading countries?
Yes.
So 90% of our food and medicine used to come through either Saudi or United Arab Emirates, and that's why the situation at the time was a very sensitive, critical situation. Many people, when they think of Qatar, they think of a country with the highest per capita income, right? But when you think about it as a dry land country, with no resources when it comes to access to fresh water, etc., and food, and so on and so forth, that was very critical for us. Of course, today in place we have plans for the future. We just inaugurated an energy plant that would secure Qatar energy and water for the coming years, basically.
Before we get into the relationships of the various countries, explain to me the crisis team. When this first unfolds in June of 2017, those first 48 hours, those first 3, 4, 5 days, who's sitting down? What's the discussion? How is this going to be addressed within your own government?
Well, I was not necessarily part of every group, as you can imagine, but many of my colleagues have been describing this to me in retrospect. And the entire country turned into a big, giant crisis group in a way. Committees were formed, working groups were formed. Everyone, it was Ramadan, everyone was awake almost 24/7. The entire country, really. And here it's worth noticing that it wasn't only Qataris. And we're very proud of the fact that it was both Qataris and non-Qataris, like residents of Qatar. Both of them came together, working together. And that's why, just to give you one example, His Highness the Emir, in the first address to the nation after the blockade, he actually thanked both, and he echoed the same gratitude during his first address at the UN General Assembly, September 2017.
Let's talk relationships. You mentioned Iran. Almost immediately made available routes for you to enter and exit your own country.
Absolutely.
What was your relationship prior to the blockade with Iran, and how has that changed?
So if you all remember, like a year before the blockade, 2016, a diplomatic crisis started between Iran and the GCC altogether due to the unfortunate event of protesters in Iran attacking the Saudi consulate, if I remember that well. And as a result of that, actually Qatar, as part of the GCC, did cut off the diplomatic ties with Iran. Unfortunately, it was Saudi that blockaded us and not Iran a year after that.
I'm going to interrupt just long enough. As we go here later in the conversation, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So if things pop to mind during the conversation that you think, oh, I would like to ask Her Excellency, you should all have a little card there in front of you, and just jot down your question and let one of the folks working know, and we will collect those and make sure your questions get asked as we go as well. Let's talk about the demands with the embargo. There was a list, and I jokingly say in the United States, if someone kidnaps or tries to extort someone, they will ask for what they want. They will say, I would like a helicopter, I would like an airplane, I would like so much money, and then they ask for something crazy. And that's so that later they can be deemed, oh, they weren't thinking in their straight mind. I would argue that on the list, of the 13 items on the list, most of the items were crazy. And there were one or two that you could debate whether or not they were legitimate diplomatic questions. But let's talk about some of those. There was a request that you shut down completely Al Jazeera.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, you got that completely right. I mean, those demands, we believe, were designed to be rejected. And as a matter of fact, there was a comment by the State Department here in the States describing these demands as non-actionable and unreasonable. One of which is actually shutting down Al Jazeera, but that only speaks of the kind of mindset that currently, unfortunately, exists in the blockading countries, a mindset that does not tolerate different voices, multiplicity of opinion. This is the reality of the situation. And the rest of the demands, I mean, they were put there just as some sort of decoration maybe, but we really believe that this was one of the core demands that they still have, and the reason is very simple, very straightforward. These are people who have hundreds, maybe thousands of prisoners of conscience. They cannot tolerate any different voice, and I mean, let's all remember that Saudi actually did cut off its diplomatic ties with Canada over a tweet. A tweet about human rights, right? So may God be with us. We have Al Jazeera.
There were a couple questions when you talk about different voices, different opinions. There were two issues on there that seemed very conflicting. I think it was the number 8 demand was that you would follow and join your neighboring Arab, Gulf and Arab countries politically, socially. That might have been the number 11 demand, but politically, socially, diplomatically, and so on. And one of the other demands was that you recognize the sovereign nature and that each state should be left to follow their own, and that you not interfere in others. And it seemed like those two were in great conflict, that if they're asking you not to interfere in any other country, shouldn't they have that same respect for Qatar?
Absolutely. But then there was a third very interesting demand. That was almost an open check. They wanted us to compensate them for, I don't know what exactly, financially, and that was actually a demand.
In an amount to be determined later.
Exactly, and no expiry date as well. So this just speaks of, once again, I mean, we really don't know what the intentions were, but no country with sovereignty would ever accept that. Why would you accept that?
The list of demands had a 10-day deadline. That deadline came and went.
Yes.
Later they came back with a slightly supplemented list that included getting rid of the World Cup, that you would give up the World Cup in 2022. And one of the things you and I spoke yesterday, and I said, what struck me as odd there is I happened to be in Africa in the time when South Africa was going to host in 2010, when South Africa was scheduled to host the World Cup. And the entire continent took great pride in that. And my question is, obviously you will think this is a good idea, but shouldn't the entire Middle East region celebrate and be united in showcasing the region when the world's eyes are focused on them in 2022?
Absolutely. I mean, this should have been a pride for the entire region. And I mean, Qatar, when we won the World Cup, the promise was a World Cup for the entire region, MENA region, Arab region. As a matter of fact, that was not only a rhetoric. Part of the projects, the World Cup projects, went to small and medium companies in neighboring countries, including some of the blockading countries. That was, from our side, we felt that this was a commitment towards our region. This was a chance, still by the way, is a chance for us to showcase the beauty we have in our region. I mean, once again, this is a rich region. This is a region with history, with civilization. It's not only about war. It's not only about conflicts. And unfortunately, I mean, they seem to insist to spoil this one moment that could have unified us. Still, of course, we still have a chance. Still, we have a couple of years until we reach 2022. But our promise, despite all of this, our promise is the following. I mean, even if the blockade continues, fans from Saudi, from United Arab Emirates, from Bahrain, and obviously from Egypt, all of them are welcome to come to Doha to enjoy the World Cup. And unfortunately, unlike our neighbors who decided to not allow our fans to attend the Asian Cup in United Arab Emirates, this will never be the position of Qatar.
Congratulations on winning the Asian Cup.
Thank you so much.
Let's talk, obviously you did not meet the demands, so the list. So let's talk about where...
Well, the demands expired.
That's right.
Remember? 10
Expired.
days. I mean, yeah.
Kuwait has tried to be a voice of reason in this. Explain the relationship of Kuwait with all of the Gulf countries.
No, I mean, once again, we look at Kuwait, as you said, as the voice of reason today in the GCC, a source for wisdom. His Highness Sheikh Sabah, the Emir of Kuwait, is looked at in Qatar as the father of the GCC, of all of us, honestly. We very much appreciate the stance of Kuwait and the Kuwaitis in terms of mediating, trying to mediate the current the conflict and the talks and everything. This is much appreciated, and in terms of the relationship between Qatar and Kuwait, they couldn't be better, to be honest. And I think Kuwait has this balanced approach towards everyone in the region, so they keep their ties with all countries in the GCC and beyond, Saudi, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and we think that this is good and healthy because it puts them in a good position to facilitate the talks should these talks take place in the future.
In any family, let's say there are 5 or 6 siblings, as they grow and they go their various ways, sometimes relationships within that family get difficult. One sister is doing very well, someone else is upset about that, and it's very difficult to maneuver. That only grows exponentially on the world stage. And when we see relationships between different states, between different countries, sometimes the relationship with one impacts your relationship with another. The United States' great nemesis in the region is Iran. You have a wonderful relationship with the United States, and yet the crisis has put you in a position where you now work regularly with Iran. Does that have an impact on your relationship with the United States?
Not at all, not at all. At the end of the day, all parties do realize that Qatar is in a position where it needs to talk to all parties. At the end of the day, Qatar is a small state. We are in a very hostile surrounding. We're wedged between regional powers, and we have to be talking to all parties. So we don't think that this has been a concern to either, to be honest.
How is the relationship with the United States?
It's excellent, beyond excellent. We just held the second strategic dialogue, January 2019. We're expanding the military base as you know, Al-Udeid base. We're collaborating at multiple levels. That's okay. This does not reflect the kind of relationship we have with the States.
Central intelligence is interfering.
Exactly.
Could you repeat it from the beginning, please?
Sure, absolutely. So the relationship between Qatar and the United States is excellent. We just held the second strategic dialogue, January 2019. We're collaborating at multiple levels, different fields. We have the counterterrorism memorandum of understanding, the only MOU on countering terror between the US and any GCC country, and was described by Secretary Tillerson at the time as something that puts Qatar ahead of its neighbors in that sense. We're also expanding the military base, Al-Udeid base. In addition to this and that, many people also kind of miss the fact that Qatar is collaborating with the US and many other countries at cultural and educational levels. And this is very important. We host 6 American universities in Qatar. Georgetown, since we're here in DC, Cornell, Texas A&M, and others. So we're really collaborating at multiple levels, and we think that the prospects of this collaboration is very promising.
What role is the United States playing, what role is the United States playing, and what role should they be playing in solving the crisis? There are those that perceive that your relationship with Iran is an impediment to a united front against Iran. Does that play into the discussions you have with Secretary Pompeo or others?
So in terms of the role of the United States has been trying to mediate through mainly Kuwait. There have been many rounds of talks, to be honest, trying to open back channels. There have been many calls from American officials. None of them was answered by our neighbors. All of them were answered positively by us. But we still think that some pressure could be exercised on our neighbors. Just to give one example, joint military exercises under the US umbrella are still happening between all GCC countries. As a matter of fact, we are collaborating when it comes to the very accusation they have against us. That is, terrorism, countering terrorism. We hold regular meetings, GCC countries and the US all together on countering terrorism. We have designated lists jointly with our neighbors, including the blockading countries. So just like they're collaborating with us when it comes to military and countering terrorism, we think that there is a possibility then to collaborate in other fields as well.
Let's turn the question around. You mentioned expanding the military base. You mentioned doing joint military exercises. How does that potentially impact your relationship with Iran?
That's a good question. And this tells you the difference between someone who's trying to act based on rational choice theory, let's put it this way, and others who are acting based on, I don't know, sentiments maybe, right? So one of the first calls we got in the beginning of this blockade, despite that we didn't have any diplomatic ties at the time, was actually from Iran, right? So once again, as long as you're, acting in the field of politics and international relations as a rational actor, you're willing to have compromises here and there, and this is what we've seen in the relationship with Iran.
We've not touched at all on your relationship with European countries. How has that changed? How has that strengthened? Who has been your good friends in this time of trouble?
All of them, to be honest. All of them, to be honest. I mean, one of the first remarks that were made in the beginning of this blockade, rejecting the measures that were taken, came out of Germany, just to give you one example. But then the French president was in Doha almost 6 months after the blockade, and he called upon the blockading countries to lift the measures. And I can tell you the same about the UK and the rest of the European Union. The relations have only strengthened for a reason. I mean, in the past we had the burden, now we call it the burden, it wasn't at the time, at least this is not how we perceived it at the time, of trying to do things through certain structures. And taking into consideration certain sensitivities, especially sensitivities that our big neighbor has. This is no longer the case, and that's why Qatar's strategy today is to strengthen the bilateral relations with everyone, and this includes, of course, European countries.
Again, if you have questions, you should have little cards there in your seat. If anything pops to mind, please scratch it down, and as long as it's not too outrageous, we'll go ahead and ask it. The blockade initially was intended to weaken your nation. Has it, or has it in some ways strengthened you as a nation?
No, it has not weakened us. As a matter of fact, we keep talking about it now as a blessing in disguise. The very fact that we are today more independent when it comes to our food security, when it comes to even our foreign policy. Once again, I mean, this independence proved to be right and useful because at least currently we're not implicated in some of the impulsive policies that we see coming out of some neighboring countries.
On Yemen, explain where Qatar is now. Where you were prior to the blockade and where you are now appear to be at odds. Explain where we are and why.
So let's remember that when we talk about Yemen, we talk about 3 years. And there are many variables that changed during these 3 years. So where we are today, as you know, the situation in Yemen in general is not where we were when the war started in Yemen. So Qatar was part of the coalition, the Arab coalition, when it started, with the understanding that this was supposed to be a very limited operation for a few weeks, right? And let's remember that this came only after a UN resolution was issued, saying that legitimacy in Yemen needs to be restored. So with all these factors taken into consideration, Qatar participated with the coalition, yet I have to emphasize that no Qatari soldier entered the Yemeni soil. Our role, our soldiers were at the borders between Saudi and Yemen, and that's very important. Qatar is no longer part of the coalition. As a matter of fact, we think that the situation in Yemen has become nihilistic. It's pointless. It's only helping to exacerbate the humanitarian crisis there, and that's why it needs to stop. That said, Qatar's involvement today in Yemen is mainly humanitarian. As a matter of fact, we signed a number of memoranda of understanding with the UNICEF, especially in the area of providing or securing access to fresh water, sanitation, etc., because we know that this is the main reason behind cholera, basically, in Yemen. So our involvement there is mainly humanitarian under the UN umbrella.
We talked earlier about the World Cup, hosting the World Cup, and there have been reports in some news outlets of abuse of workers. The World Cup, hosting it requires you to build new stadiums, to build new transportation outlets, and that requires workers that have come from other parts of the world. There have been reports of human rights abuses there. Are they accurate? Were they accurate? Have you done specific things to address those so that they don't happen moving forward?
Absolutely. This is a good question, Tim, because it allows me to elaborate on this point. So Qatar has welcomed every single human rights report that was issued. The most recent one was Amnesty International that said that so much has been done, but there is a lot yet to be done. And they pointed at certain areas that need to be improved. And we welcome that actually publicly. And we keep welcoming human rights groups because they help us to put the right checks and balances in place. So the condition or the situation, let's put it this way, the situation of the guest workers in Qatar is improving. As a matter of fact, there was a complaint against Qatar and the ILO, International Labour Organization, that was closed last year because they said that it no longer has any basis. And as a result of that, we actually signed an agreement with the ILO to open a regional office in Doha, a 3-year project that would put Qatar ahead of its region when it comes to human rights and guest workers' rights specifically. We're working relentlessly to improve the conditions of the guest workers in Qatar. As a matter of fact, we have taken the extra milestone of tackling the entire chain of what we call abusing the guest workers in Qatar. Because the abuse starts from the sending countries. Many of these workers come to Qatar in debt. This is not because we have anything wrong with the policy in Qatar, but it has to do with the abuse that starts in the sending countries. And what did we do about that? We actually opened so far 10 offices in the main sending countries to make sure that the process there is legal and transparent and no guest worker is taken advantage of when they arrive in Qatar. Is there a lot yet to be done? Yes, there is a lot, but we have abolished the exit permit, what's known as the kafala system. We have applied minimum wage, and to ensure that, to enforce it, every single company is required to open bank accounts for every single worker so that we can make sure that they actually transfer their salaries on time. So all of these measures are put in place. It's a complicated process, knowing that we are 300,000 population in terms of Qataris, but then we have almost 2 million guest workers. So this process takes time. We have hotlines that the workers can resort to in different languages. We have signage in different languages now so that they have easy access to healthcare and other things. We are, by the way, the only country in the world that provides universal healthcare, inclusive, free of money to everyone. Every guest worker in Qatar has that. Is there a lot to be done? Once again, yes, but we're getting there.
On the Gulf crisis itself, what steps need to be taken both by the other four countries, but by yours? What steps need to be taken to effectively solve this?
I see too many questions. Should I be worried? So,
Little filter through them.
no, not at all, please. I mean, so in terms of the steps, because we get asked this a lot, let's just remember one fact. Qatar is not the aggressor here. To give you an example, so Qataris are banned from entering the blockading countries. We cannot go to Saudi, to United Arab Emirates, to Bahrain, right? The question is, did we apply the same measures? The answer is no. So Saudis can still come to Qatar, Bahrainis, Emiratis. As a matter of fact, what we do at the immigration, if a Bahraini comes, or a Saudi comes, or an Emirati comes, if they ask for their passport not to be stamped, so that their government wouldn't know that they entered Qatar, we give them that. We actually give them that as a way to help families, to be reunited. So once again, there are many measures that were taken against Qatar and Qataris, Qatari people, citizens, not the government, citizens. We did not retaliate to that. I think this is kind of a positive sign that Qatar is sending, that we are always willing to resolve this. We have, as I said, answered every single call that was made by the US, the Kuwaitis, and other countries. Unfortunately, we don't see any sign from our neighbors. I'm not sure what else can we do.
Question I should have asked earlier, and that is, address your relationship with Turkey.
I mean, the relationship with Turkey is an excellent relationship. I think it has entered a strategic turn in terms of collaborating at multiple levels. Turkey is a NATO member, an important player in the region. During our crisis, in terms especially of our food security, etc., they played a major role, which we very much appreciate.
Some international analysts suggest that the bonding element, as it were, between Turkey and Qatar is an increase in support for the Muslim Brotherhood. Is that an accurate suggestion?
I don't think so, not at all. I think that this relationship is a solid relationship because it's based on mutual interest. Both are, as I said, rational actors. We know what we need from Turkey. Turkey knows what it needs from Qatar. And once again, Qatar is engaging in strategic dialogues and relations with many countries in the region and many countries globally. I mean, we have the strategic dialogue with the US. Let's remember that. And this is the most important strategic relationship that we have on Qatar. But we also have a strategic dialogue with the UK and a strategic dialogue with France. And as a matter of fact, recently Africa has become more and more relevant to us, especially in terms of the food security. Rwanda, very recently, we held very high-level discussions and negotiations to collaborate at multiple levels. Rwanda is a promising power in Africa at multiple levels, including education, by the way. So once again, I mean, Qatar is trying to strengthen its ties with all countries. I mean, Qatar with Asia, just to give you one example. This is becoming more and more strategic to us. Japan is one of the most important allies, partners that we have. It's our #1 importer of LNG. So,
on a scale of 1 to 10, how optimistic are you that the Gulf crisis can and will be solved in the short term?
sure. Let me refer to the audience. How optimistic are you? Anyone who's optimistic? No? No hope? Well, here is the answer.
It's a low number. Before we let you go, what are the specific objectives of your visit here in the United States this week?
Well, I mean, we engage with the United States on a regular basis at multiple levels. In my capacity, it's meeting with journalists, meeting also with officials, think tanks, etc. So once again, I mean, those visits happen all the time. It's very important. We receive delegations from the US all the time, and we have multiple discussions. I mean, from education to policy, interestingly enough, even religion.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for doing this. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
With that, I believe there is food.
اهلا وسهلا دكتور، كيف حالك؟ ان شاء الله بخير، تشرفنا فيك.